Wait till next week. I got it. Okay. Okay. Is it on? Okay, what's the actual formulation of the question?
Frame the context of sort of what today's conversation is going to be and to essentially setting this stage, what occurred in the last couple of years, what occurred last September, and sort of the U.S.'s role, why it's why it's so important that we address this in the United States. Then Aram will plan on policy session. 10 to 15 each.
Okay.
And then we'll do Q&A.
Okay.
Good evening. My name is Richard Ghazal, Executive Director of In Defense of Christians. Thank you all for joining us this evening, those who are here in person and those who are watching us online at home. As you may know, since October 2020, for nearly 4 years now, Azerbaijan has been engaged in a campaign of genocide against the indigenous Armenian Christians of Nagorno-Karabakh. In September of 2023, following 10 months of a blockade which starved the Christians of Nagorno-Karabakh, leaving them without food, medicine, and other essentials, Azerbaijan intensified its kinetic military operations through the bombing and forced expulsion of the 120,000 Armenian Christians from the land they've called home for thousands of years. This mass expulsion created a massive humanitarian crisis, which is still ongoing today. This series of events are just the latest in a long and ongoing history of genocide and ethnic and religious cleansing of Christian communities in the Middle East. Just in the span of the 20th century, due to persecution and genocide, the population of Christians in the Middle East has plummeted from 20% of the Middle East total population to now less than 2%, and it continues to plummet. This is a catastrophic trend. The sad reality is that Christianity throughout the Middle East now finds itself on the brink of extinction, which sadly may come to fruition within our own lifetimes. And with it, 2,000-year-old Christian heritage would also disappear. This is not a political matter. In fact, it's more than just a humanitarian matter. It's a civilizational question before us all. What's most alarming is the fact that the perpetrator in this particular genocide, Azerbaijan, is a beneficiary of American military assistance, with total U.S. assistance to Azerbaijan exceeding $1.5 billion in the last 3 decades since the fall of the Soviet Union. No active perpetrator of genocide should ever be enabled by American money and weapons. Last month, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, known as USCIRF, released its 2024 International Religious Freedom Report. USCIRF is a bipartisan federal commission established by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 as a watchdog body to monitor on matters of international religious freedom. USCIRF's annual report provides detailed analysis and policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and the U.S. Congress concerning state and non-state violators of international religious freedom. According to the 2024 report, USCIRF has recommended that Azerbaijan be designated as a country of particular concern, the most severe designation reserved for the world's most egregious violators of religious freedom. In Defense of Christians, along with our diverse coalition of partners, is actively urging the State Department to heed USCIRF's recommendation to classify Azerbaijan as a country of particular concern and impose sanctions. IDC is also advocating for legislative measures to discontinue military aid to Azerbaijan in light of its long resume of human rights violations, including closing the legal and immoral loophole which allows for presidential waiver to Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act, which you'll hear about later this evening. This evening, we'll be hearing from 2 of the foremost experts on this topic. Dr. Michael Rubin is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specialized in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. He's also a good friend of In Defense of Christians. We'll also be hearing from Aram Hamparian, Executive Director of the Armenian National Committee of America, and a member of the IDC Board of Advisors. We'll also make time for questions at the end of this evening's program. So without further ado, I welcome our friend Michael Rubin.
Thank you very much. I made my first trip to Armenia and to Artsakh in November 2020, shortly after the guns had grown silent. But many of you may not know is I went at the urging of the Baghdad Christian community, who in the course of months and months of conversations, because I go to Iraq quite frequently, said, you know, the situation in Iraq isn't great for Christians, but if you really are concerned about the plight of Christians in the world, really the crisis point is in Armenia right now. And that was shocking, but what they said was absolutely true. Now, I want to approach this issue not simply in terms of the defense of Christians, although in this case that's very much at play, but also in terms of broader American policy. I think it's safe to say that in a bipartisan way, going back at least to George H.W. Bush, the foreign policy crisis that ended up defining the administration was always something that no one had seen coming during their initial election campaign. That's point one. And point two is when an administration finds its foreign policy legacy failing, there's always an attempt, and again, doesn't matter whether you're on the Democratic side or the Republican side, there's always an attempt to do a Hail Mary pass to try to very quickly come up with some magical peace agreement somewhere else that could redefine the legacy. So I worked in the George W. Bush administration, and for many of you, the George W. Bush administration may be associated with 9/11 and the Iraq War. It could be associated with, 9/11 and the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War as well. But many people forget that towards the end of the Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice took the North Koreans off the state sponsor of terror list because she wanted to jumpstart a peace process with North Korea. Didn't go so well. Likewise, you had the Annapolis Conference, which was a really slapdash effort to somehow create Arab-Israeli peace out of the ether, as if some magical formula existed which hadn't been discovered over previous decades and discounting all the ideology involved and so forth. I'm afraid that what's going on right now with the Biden administration is actually quite similar when it comes to what's happening in Armenia. The key thing, broadly speaking, to understand Armenia and Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh is that Armenia is a democracy. It has been unequivocally a democracy and increasingly a pro-Western one since 2018. Azerbaijan, according to Freedom House, is not just a dictatorship. It's one of the worst dictatorships in the world. It rivals Eritrea, North Korea, and South Sudan. It's not quite there yet, but its trajectory is getting there pretty darn close. Now, what's truly shocking is when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh and Artsakh and the indigenous Armenian community there, according to Freedom House, it was also democratic. They had the Armenians who had existed in Nagorno-Karabakh for thousands of years had managed to put together, at the fall of the Soviet Union, a functioning parliamentary democracy. Now, it's one thing in this notion of Kissingerian diplomacy we have where immorality is somehow considered sophisticated, to throw a country under the bus. The United States has been known to do that before, but seldom have we ever tried so gratuitously to throw a democracy under the bus. Now, legally, people can say, hey, look, Nagorno-Karabakh was technically part of Azerbaijan. The United States recognized it as part of Azerbaijan in 1991. That's actually not quite true. The recognition of borders was dependent upon a test that included self-determination, that included the willingness of the governments to abide by international law and so forth. Constitutionally, Nagorno-Karabakh, which had always been part of Armenia until Joseph Stalin gerrymandered the country, had the constitutional prerogative to seek its freedom, and it did so democratically and constitutionally. The United States could have fully recognized this, but to say to a democratic population, you need to live under a dictatorship, is truly immoral, and it is against this notion of the policy which is of benefit to the United States. Forget, again, the Christian community for a second. From a sheer naked calculation of national interest, our willingness to see the Artsakh Armenians betrayed was contrary to that, because we know that as democracies flourish, that pro-Western sentiments flourish. And in this part of the world, so close to Iran, so close to Turkey, it's important that we have a flourishing democracy that is moderate and stable. Now, some people will argue, and it's a kalumi, that Armenia actually isn't pro-Western. One thing that astounds me, and many of you know that, I mean, it was a long intellectual evolution for me to get to where I am on Armenia right now, especially vis-a-vis my previous positions with regard to Turkey. But even though ultimately I switched my positions with regard to Turkey based on what my read of the facts on the ground, the fact of the matter is, in Washington, it's safe to say that we did not fully recognize the reality of Recep Tayyip Erdogan for well over a decade after he actually changed Turkey. We were calibrating our policy to the wishful thinking of the international community rather than to the reality on the ground. And this statistic comes from the Turkish Interior Ministry. And it was cited by Voice of America that since Recep Tayyip Erdogan came to power, the murder rate of women inside Turkey has increased 1,400%. And that's a reflection of the impunity which is felt in terms of the honor crimes and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, once we started recognizing Turkey for what it was, in many ways it was too late to salvage key aspects of U.S. interests. The reason I bring this up is because the same thing is in play today with regard to Azerbaijan. We can suggest that Azerbaijan is a pro-Western secular source of stability in the region. But the fact of the matter is, and Armenia is pro-Russian, pro-Iranian, where somehow Azerbaijan is not. The fact of the matter is, Armenia's trade with Iran is equivalent to America's trade with Aruba. It's a pittance. Now, it's a pittance that is also forced upon Armenia by the illegal blockade that Turkey has upon them. Under the Treaty of Kars, Turkey has absolutely no legal right to shut the border with Armenia. That border is demarcated. Now, with regard to Azerbaijan, today they are the chief source of laundered Iranian and Russian gas going through Azerbaijani pipelines to Turkey and then onward to Europe. While Armenia has been distancing itself, Azerbaijan has been following the Turkish model of trying to play both sides off each other. And while it's doing this, religious liberty has also been shrinking, which also gives an indication beyond the facade, the same facade that Erdogan once had, of the religious ideology that's at play. Now, my first experience with Armenians was when I lived in the Islamic Republic of Iran. I lived in Isfahan, in the Jolfa neighborhood, which many of you know is largely Armenian. They used to call me, not the people in Jolfa, but others used to call me Pesari Shaitani Bozorg, which is Persian for son of the great Satan. At any rate, in that Armenia district, and you had a wonderful pro-Western sentiment and a much more tolerant sentiment than perhaps the Islamic Republic wanted. And at the time, people used to say, and I would go to church, I would go to synagogue, people used to say, oh, the same number, Iran has the most Jews in the Middle East after Israel. But you know what? I caught on after going to Iran for 7 months and following this for more than a decade afterwards, that people kept using the same statistics that were more than a decade old. And when it actually came to knocking on doors and seeing what was open, the number of Jews in Iran was actually just a fraction of what Iranians and many mainstream pundits claimed it to be. The same thing today is true with regard to Azerbaijan, both to the Jewish community, which is only about a quarter of the numbers which Azerbaijan claims, and those that can get out are getting out, as well as to the Christian community that remains, many of whom were put to flight by the same sort of atrocities that we see in Artsakh. Sorry, and of course my time, okay, there's the timer. So we've got an issue where we need to calibrate our policy to reality. Now, even if you do want to say that Armenia, look at it, Armenia has relations with Iran. Armenia has relations with Russia. Therefore, we should be on the opposite side of geopolitics than Armenia is. My response to that is, what would it have been like if, when Anwar Sadat decided that he was no longer wanted to be in the Soviet camp, the American response was, Egypt is too close to the Russians. Therefore, Egypt will always be close to the Russians. We shouldn't try to flip them. What is going on now geopolitically, beyond simply the issue of the Christians in the region, is that there is a debate underway about what it will take and what it will take to flip Armenia and how we can truly secure them. Now, this is my worry. I spend a lot of time in Armenia, and I have absolutely no doubt that the Armenians, both in terms of their brains and their hearts, truly want to turn their backs on Russia and truly have no interest in anything more than the casual border state economic relationship with Iran. But what I worry about is this. We can try to do two things. We can try to flip them and encourage them to throw the Russians out and embrace the United States, but Armenia is a landlocked country. And if we do that, if we encourage them to stick their heads out, only to get them chopped off, I would argue that that is immoral. So what can we do to give greater guarantees to Armenia that we, like the French are right now, like the Indians are right now, truly have their backs? The other thing to keep in mind, and this goes back to the Christians, is that we talked about these peace deals in which the people, the Republic of Artsakh, this democratically elected statelet that was democratic, that had a contiguous history, that in many ways it was much more like Kosovo than like Donetsk or Luhansk or any of these made-up republics that Russia likes to cite. They had an agreement that there would be free passage back and forth. The Russians violated it. I went to see the Azerbaijanis blockaded the population, starved some. I went to see the illegal checkpoint. It was a tent and a single BTR, an armored personnel carrier. It could have been taken out like that. All we would have had to do was leaflet and say, you better clear this road, otherwise you're not going to exist anymore. And yet, instead of taking that leadership and showing that our diplomacy meant something, the largest indigenous Christian community in the region, in the Middle East, ceased to exist. That's why it's so important, besides the legislative agenda, which Aram is going to talk about, to stand for a right of return before this ethnic cleansing is made permanent by the decades of time. We can't let this sort of dictatorship win. The other point I would make is that when it comes to last-minute administrations, and I'm winding down with this, and that Hail Mary pass, the Biden administration seems intent on trying to force Armenia into a peace deal with Azerbaijan. Now, Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, is a man that says that Armenia doesn't have the right to exist. It doesn't exist. That Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, is actually Western Azerbaijan. The rhetoric is, and I've written on this, is parallel to what Saddam Hussein once said about Kuwait, about southern Iran, and so forth. It is irredentism, and it is signaling what he is going to do in the future. We are so desperate for peace with Armenia that just like with Artsakh, we are willing to pressure Armenia, democratic Armenia, to make concessions in the face of dictatorship. While the border of Armenia and Turkey is demarcated, the border of Armenia and Azerbaijan is not. I went with Sam Brownback. We saw Azerbaijani troops inside Armenian territory. We are at a point where instead of saying the 1975 Soviet General Staff map is what the United States recognizes, and if Azerbaijani troops are on the wrong side of that border, they are occupying Armenian territory. Instead of doing that, we're saying, let's have peace, and then maybe we can demarcate the border. That wouldn't work in any situation, let alone when one side is irredentist and is committed ideologically to ousting the other. Let me conclude with this. Negotiating with Azerbaijan is in many ways like negotiating with forcing Israel to negotiate with Hamas. Now, Ilham Aliyev might be much more secular in his appearance, and he might be Shia instead of Sunni. But the reason I say this is because what motivates Ilham Aliyev isn't grievance. It's not some minor land dispute. Fundamentally, it's ideology. Just like Hamas's covenant refuses to recognize any existence of the state of Israel, Ilham Aliyev refuses to recognize any legitimacy to Armenian statehood or even the existence of the Armenian people. For the sake of a short-term legacy boost, we should not be making the same mistake 3 times. So with that, let me turn the floor back over.
You know, even as moderator, I'll happily say, I'm glad you blew by your timer because I could listen to your analysis for hours. So thank you for that, Michael. As you know, In Defense of Christians focuses on a number of areas and topics throughout the Middle East and even into Northern Africa. One of which, of course, is Armenia and Armenian issues. There's no group we look to with more faith and trust than our friends at the Armenian National Committee of America when it comes to Armenian policy and where we can support in Armenian-centered advocacy. So with that, I'd like to welcome my friend, Aram Hamparian.
Thank you, Michael. That was profound, insightful, comprehensive. I think just what we needed. Rich, you know, I've always said I don't know where ANC starts and IDC ends. We're brothers, and we've been through many battles over this past decade, and deeply grateful for the solidarity we've always had from our IDC friends. So I'd like to share a few things. I think if Dr. Rubin shared, let's say, an analysis of the situation and perhaps a diagnosis of some of the ills in that part of the world, I can touch upon some of what we might consider the remedies or proposed remedies. They're within the context, like I'll say the ANC's, like our North Star might be something like Armenia's survival, that this ancient nation, at-risk nation, landlocked, blockaded, genocide survivor state, that it might survive, that might be able to be part of handing our ancient tribe to my daughter's generation, that she might be able to hand it to her children one day. And that's a situation I think that not every country faces. I'm sure if I woke up tomorrow as a Brazilian, or if I lived in China, France, or Indonesia, pick the country, you have a lot of problems. You know, all the problems that people have around the world. Probably one of them is not worrying if your nation will be around by the end of the week. That's actually where we are as Armenians. If you look at the map of where Armenians lived 1,000 years ago, and you look at where Armenians live today, it's a tiny fraction. And within the last year, maybe a quarter of that was chopped off. And as Dr. Rubin said, and there's now claims on every last little bit of that tiny partitioned Armenia that remains. So our North Star is very much like, how might there be in Armenia? Number one. Number two, those activities fall into three general baskets today, and then I'll run through some of our legislative initiatives. The first basket might be, how can the United States help hold Azerbaijan accountable? That would be one basket. A second would be, how might our government help those who've been impacted by this violence, the refugees? So on the one hand, accountability, the other hand, assistance. And then third, longer term, is, can there be a pathway home for the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, for the Armenians of Artsakh? So accountability, assistance, and a pathway home. I'll start with probably our top legislative priority, which is stopping U.S. military assistance to Azerbaijan. This entire war that started in 2020, the ethnic cleansing, the genocide that took place in 2023, all took place in the context of the United States maintaining an ongoing military aid program to Azerbaijan. We talk to people in the administration, and very often they throw up their arms and say, what can we possibly do? I'm like, well, how about you stop arming the side that's doing the damage? Like, that would be a good place to start. First, do no harm. I think that's a good principle. So to get that done, right, we've undertaken a lot of work. And we're successful in the U.S. Senate in passing unanimously a bill that would prohibit aid to Azerbaijan, that would enforce the sanction, essentially, the restriction on U.S. aid to Azerbaijan. And now we're working on the House side to have its counterpart passed. In the Senate, it was Senator Peters. In the House, it's Congressman Lawler of New York, both very good friends of ours. We're working it through the committee process. We're also trying through various amendments. So Mr. Lawler just offered an amendment to the foreign aid bill. We hope it's ruled in order. We hope it's adopted. We hope it's enacted. And that would essentially say that Azerbaijan, maybe we can't tell Azerbaijan what to do. Maybe we can't always restrain Azerbaijan, but we sure as heck can say that you're going to do it without U.S. military assistance. It's not simply the dollars that have flowed to Azerbaijan, although they are significant, but Azerbaijan's a wealthy country. I think at a deeper level, it's the stamp of approval. When we provide military assistance to a country, it's a way of saying, you're doing fine, don't worry. If we were upset, we surely would cut off the assistance. So that's number one. Number two are sanctions. Our government has passed a variety of sanctions over the years that can be enforced in a variety of different ways. One set of them is the global Magnitsky sanctions. We believe that I think 44 officials of Azerbaijan have crossed the line, have become sanctionable under the global Magnitsky sanctions. And colleagues of ours in the Armenian Legal Center have filed those cases with the Departments of State and Treasury. We're making the case as best we can. We hope it's given fair consideration. We think on the merits, the administration should act, but we're not certain that they will. I would offer a thought, and this is one I learned the hard way, which is sanctions are not policy. Sanctions are a tool of policymakers. And if the policymakers have absolutely no intent to sanction somebody, they could, commit the worst of sins in the light of day and never see a single sanction. It's very much a tool that's deployed, to pursue interests. And the interests of the present administration, the past administration, is that basically Azerbaijan gets a free pass. So that's number one, is cutting off the military aid. Number two is sanctioning senior officials. A third is something that we've tried without success so far, which is Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. This is a very old provision. It was passed in the 1970s. It's never once been enforced, but it basically says if a country receives U.S. military assistance, the Senate can pass a privileged motion to force the administration to report on that country's human rights abuses. It's not a very high ask. It's not a very tough ask. It doesn't cut aid. It simply asks for a report, right? So a senator, this is unusual in the Senate because most things in the Senate and the House need the approval of gatekeepers at the committee level, at the leadership level. This is a privilege motion that any senator can exercise. They can say, I want this brought to the floor, and in short order, a day or two, it needs to be brought to the floor for an up or down vote. We're pushing very hard to make that happen. We want to do it in a bipartisan way in the Senate. Of course, that's super important. So that's that's where we are on that effort as well. The House effort, we have a House effort, but it's not privileged, so that it depends on the Speaker and the Foreign Affairs Chair, and we're not there yet. We're also looking at the foreign aid bill, and there's an amendment that's been offered to provide $100 million in support for the refugees. We obviously support that. There's another amendment that says that the U.S. assistance that flows into Azerbaijan should not be used to develop Artsakh. It should not be used essentially to wipe out the Armenian presence and essentially foreclose the possibility of Armenians returning. That Azerbaijan may in fact choose to do that, but they should do it without our tax dollars. And a couple other fronts that we're fighting on. One is USURF. We definitely want the State Department to follow the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's recommendation that Azerbaijan be essentially blacklisted for its violations of religious freedom. There's also an upcoming climate conference. The world's biggest climate conference this November will be hosted in Baku, Azerbaijan, which is really a major carbon producing state whose president recently said, nobody will tell us that we can't use our God-given resources, oil resources to, for the prosperity of our people. So the global climate movement's like kind of moving away from fossil fuel, and here is President Aliyev of Azerbaijan embracing it and then hosting the actual conference that's supposed to mitigate the very harms that he's contributing to. So also right of return, a priority for us. It is U.S. policy, it's international policy that people forced violently from their homes do have a right to return. It's and our administration, I think Ambassador Michael Carpenter, voiced U.S. support for the right of Armenians to return to Artsakh, to Nagorno-Karabakh, but it's been followed up with absolutely nothing, like absolutely nothing. It was just a one-off, check the box, sure, go home, and then nothing to make that possible. If an Armenian were to return there, they would certainly be subject to violence and certainly could not live in safety. I don't know that a single family would subject their children or older relatives to that type of threat. Two more things. One, a bit far afield. The Congress had passed recognition of the Armenian Genocide now 5 years ago. There's an effort before the House and Senate to teach about the Armenian Genocide in public schools, to set aside some funds to allow the Library of Congress to prepare materials for that purpose. They're modeled after a Holocaust bill, which does exactly the same thing, a very admirable effort, and led by many of the same legislators. I'll wrap up with one final non-legislative but electoral priority. The Congress, the co-chair of the Azerbaijan caucus, is Congressman Cuellar of Texas. And he's always given us a lot of grief, and we always suspected that there was more to it than we could see. And then this April, we woke up one morning and read a federal indictment charging him, 54-page indictment, charging him with accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes from Azerbaijan in order to basically rig some congressional action in Azerbaijan's favor at our expense. And it turns out that the allegation in the indictment is that, like in 2017, 2018, we were pushing very hard, if you can imagine, for just a couple of $1 million to demine the civilian areas of Nagorno-Karabakh, so that this like surrounded little region, this democracy in the Caucasus, so that maybe kids could walk to school without getting blown up, or farmers might be able to cultivate a little bit more land. And we were fighting like crazy just for a couple $1 million through Halo Trust, a great group, to demine that. And we faced like ridiculous levels of opposition. And then only later, 5 years later, this past April, woke up to find out that a very, very senior member of Congress had been allegedly enlisted by a foreign government to torpedo that exact process. And that's super, that's sobering. And certainly, I guess, just a call for us to redouble our efforts. We're encouraging members of the House to call upon Congressman Cuellar to step down. And if he won't step down, they should vote to expel him. And in any event, we look forward to his departure from Capitol Hill. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Aram, for that. And as you know, we stand shoulder to shoulder with you on all of these legislative priorities. And with that, I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you may have, folks who are present with us here today, as well as folks online who wish to ask a question. When you do ask a question, just if you could address one of the two speakers, or if it's a general question, anybody would, feel free. Not all at once, please.
Don't ask, I will ask you.
Yep. So we do have a mic set up over there, just so we can get the question on camera as well.
Hi, my name is Sophia Trammell. Thank you so much for your speech. Why is the United States government giving military aid to Azerbaijan? For what is the reason that they provide? Just weighing which is more important, our interest in the region or genocide. What is their reason for doing so?
I'll just repeat the question for the cameras because I'm not sure whether the mic was fully picking everything up. But the basis of the question, which Aram will answer, is why is the United States giving military assistance to Azerbaijan anyway? And it's an oil-rich state in the Caucasus. What's the logic? What's the reason?
It's a really good question. I think initially, there have been two waves of military aid to Azerbaijan, and this required a waiver of a law in order for the aid to travel there. And one was during the war in Afghanistan. There was Azerbaijan was considered a way station, a place to land aircraft and then move on to Central Asia. That was one. Number two reason cited was to protect energy facilities in the Caspian. And there was something, the Aussies had something called the Caspian Guard. And under George W. Bush, that seemed to be the majority of assistance, facilitating transit to Afghanistan and then the Caspian Guard. Then it radically boosted under President Trump and then increased and continued, let's say, under President Biden. And I'm going to say, this is my read. I don't claim any special insights, and no one's ever given us an honest answer, although we've asked a few times. In around 2017, the administration adopted a different strategy to Nagorno-Karabakh, one that was less about a peace process and more toward, I think, signaling to Azerbaijan, your territory, you do what you will. And the two markers of that were, number one, a very aggressive effort to stop the humanitarian aid to Artsakh. We were told, the phrase used with us by the State Department was, it's time for the aid to follow the policy, not the policy to follow the aid, right? Because the aid, they viewed our efforts to get congressional approval for aid to Artsakh to be a policy creating aid package. And they're like, no, we're going to take that back, number one. And number two was the boost in military aid and a withdrawal in many ways from the peace process itself. So I think in this latter stage, it was, and again, I may be overly cynical on this, but I think it was like part of a signaling to Azerbaijan, like a green light, do what you will. Okay.
I'm just going to add two things. As a historian, I get paid to predict the past. My critics would say I only get that right about 50% of the time. But I just want to go back a little bit further in time to give some background to understand why the changes which Aram had said under George W. Bush, why there was even a need for a change. The whole reason why in the Freedom Support Act, aid to Azerbaijan was forbidden was as the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Azerbaijanis undertook a number of pogroms against the Armenian population in Baku and also in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was, again, always a vast majority Armenian Christian populated area. Stalin had gerrymandered it. But even then, many Azerbaijanis who were relocated to Nagorno-Karabakh in the 1960s and 70s as the Soviets built factories and so forth and tried to play demographic games, they initially, as the Soviet collapse was coming, decided that they were simply going to go home. They had no desire to live where the Soviets told them they should live because the Azerbaijanis knew that they had no roots there. The Armenians did. And so what the Azerbaijanis started to do as the Soviet Union was collapsing was try to encircle Nagorno-Karabakh, and there was a real fear that they were going to try to massacre the population, more than 100,000 people. And that is why initially the ban came on military aid to Azerbaijan, which then, under the Bush administration, for the reasons that Aram said as an analyst rather than as an advocate, occurred. The other point to keep in mind with regard to this is there's something called the Minsk process, which was the idea through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe that the Azerbaijan-Armenian Nagorno-Karabakh solution should be rectified diplomatically with some sense of self-determination, and negotiations went on for decades. It was as these negotiations were coming to a conclusion, there was behind-the-scenes discussions as to what countries the peacekeepers should be drawn from. There was talk about land for security, that sort of issue. Similar to what has happened in the Israeli-Arab conflict. What happened against that backdrop was the second Nagorno-Karabakh war in September to November 2020. History matters. It was done on the 100th anniversary of the Ottoman invasion of independent Armenia. That symbolism Americans didn't get, but people in the region got. The best analogy to what happened in 2020 would be the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974, and we're coming up just in a couple weeks to the 50th anniversary of that. Many Turks will say, hey, look, the invasion of Cyprus was meant to protect the Turkish Cypriot population. And that may have been true for a day or two, but then the Greek military government collapsed. Greeks embraced a democracy. The Turks had occupied 3% of Cyprus. It was when the British, the Turks, the Cypriots, the Greeks, the Americans were negotiating in Geneva in July 1974 that Turkey invaded again. The guns had already fallen silent. There was no threat to the Muslim population there, and Turkey ethnically cleansed 1/3 of Cyprus. And it remains that way, ethnically cleansed today. Now, circling back, Haydar Aliyev, who's the father of the current leader, used to be the head of the KGB in Azerbaijan and a Soviet Politburo member in Moscow, famously said with regard to Turkey, we are one people, two states. And so when you look at the Turkish rhetoric, when you look at the Azerbaijani rhetoric, there's very little difference, if I may, between what the Azerbaijanis and the Turks have been doing to the Armenians 100 years, more than 100 years after the genocide, and what they've been doing in northern Syria and what they've been doing in Cyprus as well. The problem we have in the US government is we have these arbitrary bureaucratic divisions between Africa, between Europe, between the Caucasus and so forth, and we sometimes don't recognize as we're pigeonholed into these desks that the same pattern is happening in multiple locations at once. It's important to recognize that pattern.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We hear a lot, obviously, and understandably, about the intense tension to the east and west of sovereign Armenia, and a little less about the north and the south. And I'm just wondering if there's particular insight to be offered from the relations with Georgia, or for that matter, anything that can be problematic as far as propagandistic issues, given Armenians' dependency on some degree of peaceable relations with Iran.
Okay. First of all, when it comes to relations with Iran, here's the key to remember. And I am a hawk on Iran. No, I mean, I am officially sanctioned by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And for that matter, I'm officially sanctioned by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. So even though some, perhaps my good friends at the Hudson Institute, occasionally say that I'm a little bit too sympathetic, the Iranians know I'm not, period. The reason why, as an analyst, not as an advocate, the reason why Armenia has relations with Iran is because Armenia is its economy largely depends on produce and some manufactured goods. It doesn't have hydrocarbons. Because Azerbaijan blockades Armenia for the purpose of having because they have the territorial dispute, and because Turkey, in sympathy, one country, one people, two countries, blockades Armenia against the terms of the Treaty of Kars, it means that Armenia has no other choice to get its goods to market than to send them basically into Iran. If your exports are pomegranates, you can't compete if you have to add airfare to the price of exporting pomegranates. The best way to undercut this, if from the US government point of view, is to put pressure on Turkey to open the border. If Turkey opened the border to Armenian produce, there would be no excuse, no reason for Armenia to have this sort of economic relations with Iran. But, I want to make some, and with regard to Georgia, there's other tensions, which perhaps Aram could get into. I'm not as good on Georgia. But let me put it this way. Let's make lemons out of lemonade. The Armenian diaspora is large in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, in Russia, and in Iran. Yerevan is a pro-Western democracy. Armenia is a pro-Western democracy. What better way, if we have to talk to people, to do it through a pro-Western democracy, rather than, for example, through Qatar, which is openly sympathetic to Hamas and the Taliban? Why not have these sorts of talks? I mean, very quietly, even though it's not public. The Biden administration is also in talks in Oman, not just with the Houthis, that part's public, but also with Bashar al-Assad's regime in terms of rapprochement, according to the Omanis. Why should we use middlemen we don't trust when we have equally connected middlemen who actually, their heart is in the right place and their ideology is trending to the right place? But with that, let me let Aram add to the discussion.
I don't have much to add. I just, as a general principle, that the way folks think about Armenia in this city is in a geopolitical context primarily, and a moral context at some level. But it's something like, here are the sort of the major thrusts of American policy, and how might relations with this small country advance this or that, or mitigate that harm, or something like that. And that's one way to think about it. It's just not how I happen to think about it, which is something like, these guys are in a tough spot. I'm sure you like them to check every box, right? And to kind of like fit into your template of how the world should be. But these guys are just trying to survive. And that's a very, very different way of thinking about things. A thought occurred to me that you mentioned land for peace. And if there's I'm not a historian, but if there's are examples of where land for peace has worked, I don't know them. And I will say, if land for peace did work, and again, look at the land upon which Armenians lived 2,000 years ago, and look at where they are today. If land for peace worked, Armenia would be the most peaceful nation on the planet. And it's not. With every loss, there's a call for yet more, yet more, yet more. I think Benny Morris co-wrote, I forget his co-author's name, the 30-year genocide. You could argue that it's a genocide that started in the 1890s and is actually continues until this very day. And people say, like, what's the end state? What's the stable equilibrium that will come out of this? Like, what is it that Armenia can give to Azerbaijan and Turkey that would cause them to back off and say, okay, here's how we're going to exist together? It's like, I see no evidence of that. I think the end game is no Armenians, right? And what's my basis for saying that? Which is, there's no Armenians almost everywhere there used to be Armenians, right? It's like the history has been something like 90% of Armenian space is now without Armenians. There's 10% with Armenian space, and then it was 12, 6 months ago. Now it's 10, and we fear that it'll be down to 8, and then 6, then 2, and then we're gonna be in a museum somewhere in Yerevan, the Azerbaijani capital of Western Azerbaijan.
Actually, let me do something which I'm going to try to cite Bernard Lewis in a way that's not going to drive you nuts. Bernard Lewis wrote a book about the Middle East called Middle East, the History of the Last 2,000 Years. And the reason he did this is too often when I'm a product of Middle Eastern studies. That's what my doctorate's in. When we study the Middle East, we start in maybe 570 with the birth of Muhammad. And if you're starting in 570, then you forget all the context which exists before and the context in which Muhammad came to be. Why is it that US policy, when it comes to looking at this region, starts with Joseph Stalin rather than 2 or 3 years before Joseph Stalin? Why is it we're not going back to the original Republic of Armenia? And instead, the United States government, is actually endorsing and legitimizing the cheap gerrymandering which Joseph Stalin engaged in. Now, we could say, oh, the Almaty Declaration of 1991 made the sovereign boundaries of all the former Soviet states the basis through which we work. Well, that's all well and good, until you consider that Nagorno-Karabakh was an autonomous oblast, and that Ilham Aliyev has rejected those same boundaries. Why do we have to focus more on the Almaty Declaration of 1991 than the Azerbaijani aggressor does? And so in this case, I mean, look, it's a shame that the American sense of history happens in 4-year integrals. And ancient history is anything that became before the current president, whoever the current president happens to be at any given time. The fact of the matter is we need a broader perspective, because it's our handicap. Everyone else in the region is looking at this with a broader perspective. Let me give you just one more example very quickly. Let's use another example. Let's talk about Israel. Should we look at the population of the Jews and what's legitimate or what's not only in terms of 1948, or should we recognize that there were pogroms that existed in Hebron, for example, in the 1930s? Should we look at the expulsion of the Jews from the old city in 1948, 1949, as somehow this means that, as the UN has said, or as Amnesty International has said, that the Jewish quarter of the old city is somehow occupied territory? And the fact of the matter is, the Jewish quarter is Jewish through history, and I may add, the Armenian quarter has been Armenian through history, and no one should change that because of some artificial, convoluted sense of where we want to start history in an illegitimate way.
There's been a lot of discussion about the survival of Armenia and touching on the ongoing genocide that's happened there. I was hoping if one or either or both of you could comment on the ongoing erasure of cultural heritage sites and the significance that has, and what the U.S. could do to reverse or halt those destructions.
I'm going to let Aram answer this, but I just want to say that in my own intellectual evolution, as I once was much more sympathetic to the Turkish point of view and shifted over time, and I've written about this publicly, so this isn't secret, what really changed my mind was that very question. The cynical attempts to erase history, specifically the cemetery at Jolfa, where thousands of gravestones that dated back more than a millennia were decimated, dug up, and destroyed. We have this via satellite. We have videotape of this, and the Azerbaijanis put out statements saying nothing happened, this never existed. Countries which are secure in their own arguments don't need to fabricate history. But with regard to what's going on currently in occupied portions of Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as occupied portions of Armenia itself, let me turn the floor over.
Sure. Dr. Rubin he touched on the cemetery in Julfa, which is in the Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhichevan, just across the Artsakh River. And it was, I don't know, maybe just luck, or good luck, bad luck. It was destroyed, but it was destroyed on videotape. Somebody across the border videotaped the destruction, and it was some group of Azeri soldiers in uniform who came with sledgehammers and bulldozers, and they knocked each beautiful cross stone down, the intricately carved, And then when they were all like on the ground, they took bulldozers and they literally pushed it into the river. And then they put a firing range in that land. And as it happened, like within days, of course, we got a copy of the videotape and took it to the Department of State, who told us, well, these things happen on both sides. We're like, well, if they happen on both sides, you should call it out on both sides. But we're not aware of Armenians doing stuff like that. But if they are, well, certainly bring that to the light of day. And they're like, well, they shuffled their feet and mumbled something. They said also that, you know, we're just moments away from a wonderful peace agreement. If introducing this into the mix would torpedo the peace process. And it really just comes down to tossing the Armenians under the bus, which has become like a bit of a sport in this country for decades. U.S. policymakers are quick to toss just, the Armenians to Turkey, the Armenians to Azerbaijan. Apparently we're a very cheap commodity. So that being said, Azerbaijan is, if Turkey's argument on the genocide is something like the Armenians represented a threat, we had to relocate them. It's like, if they represent a threat and you have to relocate them, why have you spent the last century knocking down every Armenian church that you can? And Azerbaijan took Artsakh, took Nagorno-Karabakh, and literally you can look at the satellite images and just see, like, there was a church here and now it's just rubble. In instance after instance after instance. One of the last places I visited was Dadivank, which was established by a student of the Apostle Thaddeus. And that priest stayed there for months and months after the war, but ultimately were forced out. But the fate of that church will either be destruction or conversion into a mosque. We've seen like kind of lip service from the administration, but when we're really pushed for support, we haven't gotten it. I'll give one example. A university project is doing monitoring work to keep an eye on the churches that exist. They have a very good list of that. And they had actually asked the State Department at one point, can we have access to the same, I forget the name of the company, or the same program, the same satellite imagery that you provided to track historical sites in Syria and Afghanistan? And they were denied for no good reason. I think once again, it comes down to a policy that is, for whatever reason, decided that we're going to appease Azerbaijan and at the expense of the Armenians.
Just let me add two things there. It wouldn't cost that much money to demand, as a condition of any sort of relationship with Azerbaijan. And remember, the Azerbaijanis have thrown out the French ambassador for having too much moral clarity. When the French are thrown out for moral clarity and the Americans are left behind, that's telling. But why not have 24/7 video monitoring? If in theory we can do it with nuclear centrifuges, how hard could it be to do with ancient monasteries? The other thing that the Azerbaijanis are doing, and again, this has parallels with rejectionism of any Israeli roots, any Jewish roots to Israel, is the Azerbaijanis have come up and said, all these ancient Armenian monasteries with the ancient Armenian inscriptions and so forth, they're all fraudulent. That these are just a made-up fantasy, and it really, they were Albanian churches from an ancient Albanian sect that disappeared centuries ago, and the Armenians have claimed it as their own. I mean, this is akin to saying, despite all archaeological evidence to the contrary, that there is no Jewish roots, for example, in Jerusalem. And then to go further, as the Palestinians have done, and as the Azerbaijanis have done in a different context, whenever archaeological evidence does emerge, to try to sandblast it or destroy it. We need to recognize that this is a pattern, and I've written in other contexts. Religious freedom, look, I care deeply about the fate of the Christians in Nagorno-Karabakh and elsewhere in the Caucasus. But more broadly speaking, we can engage in wishful thinking with regard to our diplomatic processes against any numbers of states. I would argue across the board in North Korea, in Iran, in Ukraine, where certain denominations' churches are being destroyed, in Nagorno-Karabakh, that truly the metric, the canary in the coal mine about whether a regime has become responsible, has become reformed, is to gauge that reform through the prism of religious freedom. I can think of no state where there was true reform and religious freedom continued to be violated. That's why it's so essential to hold Azerbaijan to the religious freedom fire if we want, genuinely speaking, there to be peace in the region.
I remember some years ago, the Hagia Sophia, this beautiful Orthodox cathedral in Constantinople, which was, basically taken from a church and I think it was turned to a mosque initially, then into a museum, and then a few years ago was reconverted into a mosque. And we joined with many others, including IDC and our Greek friends and a lot of others, to ask the U.S. ambassador to really raise his voice and protest that. And I recall he did leave the embassy, marched over to Hagia Sophia, now a mosque, not to protest it, but to participate in the first service, basically to say that's perfectly fine with us, in the person of our ambassador. That's the message we're sending. And if you're, and again, it's somewhere in the State Department, Defense Department, or intelligence, somebody thinks that they're clever, they're moving the chess pieces and they're manipulating and managing Recep Erdogan as if you can manage Recep Erdogan. But again, if you're now a Christian, let's say a Greek Orthodox Christian living in Istanbul or Constantinople, you would see it very differently. You would say that we've been here for a long time. This was once a great Greek city. This is still a beautiful Greek Orthodox cathedral, and we are abandoned by the world. Those very folks who should be the first to stand up for us, who have the luxury to stand up for us. Maybe if you're Greek or Armenian or another minority within Turkey, you don't have the luxury to stand up and fight, but there are people here in America who have every ability to stand up and fight, and yet we're silent, we're bullied or bribed somehow or into silence, and it's a sad testament. And I think we can do better. And I think through your scholarship and your writings and the work of IDC, hopefully we contribute a little bit to this effort. We can kind of turn things around.
Well, thank you all for your remarks, and thank you all for being here this evening. We have some food and drink left. Please hang around, mingle, and enjoy what's left. And please feel free to approach any one of the speakers this evening, and I'm sure they'd be happy, as you could see already, happy to talk more on this issue. So thanks for being here. Have a good evening.